Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about thinking on your feet. Your Law School Toolbox hosts are Alison Monahan and Lee Burgess. That's me. We're here to demystify the law school and early legal career experience so you'll be the best law student and lawyer you can be. We're the co-creators of the Law School Toolbox, the Bar Exam Toolbox, and the career-related website Career Dicta. Alison also runs the Girls Guide to Law School. If you enjoy the show, please leave a review or rating on your favorite listening app. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can reach us via the contact form on lawschooltoolbox.com, and we'd love to hear from you. And with that, let's get started.
Welcome back to the Law School Toolbox podcast. Today we're talking about how to get more comfortable speaking on your feet, whether that's in class, in a work meeting, or even in court. And we would like to thank a reader for this question. Write to us, your question might be answered. She wrote in with a fairly common issue. One of my main weaknesses in law school classes is thinking on my feet when I'm called on. I know the law, I'm prepared for class, I understand the cases, but when I'm called on, I freeze.
Oof, yeah.
So this happens to a lot of people. In class, in other high-pressure situations, such as work meetings or court, sometimes on tests, but that's a separate topic. But we do have some suggestions. Mm-hmm. So, Lee, what's our first suggestion?
Well, I think the first suggestion you want to keep in mind is that you have to try and physically relax. So we've learned a lot about anxiety. I feel like I've learned a lot about anxiety doing the work that we do. And this whole like fight or flight, and that you have these physiological responses to anxiety. So, you know, it's easier said than done to try and physically relax, but anxiety can make your body seize up, which compounds the mental shutdown.
Right. I mean, because this is basically like it's a bodily and a mental thing going on, and they're kind of reinforcing each other. Right. So
your body thinks there's a tiger coming.
Right. And it says, shut the brain down and run.
Right. Exactly.
And then it makes it very hard to respond coherently to the questions that your scary tiger professor is asking you.
Right.
One person that we know who does work with bar students kind of reckons it to like a snow globe. And this is specifically in the test anxiety. Although I did read an article in the New York Times yesterday about the same glitter jar concept for like adolescent girls managing their emotions. Same concept. So basically you get shaken up and you have to sort of, let the glitter settle or let the snow settle before you can start thinking clearly again.
That's true.
So unfortunately, when you get called on in class, you don't really have a lot of time like you might even on an exam where you could take 2 or 3 minutes. I mean, you can't just stand there for 3 minutes like waiting, taking deep breaths and counting to 10. But I mean, I think you can at least use this technique and like take a deep breath or 2 before you start your answer. So if your professor turns to you suddenly and says, Miss Burgess, and you start to panic.
Or sometimes it can take a minute for you to recognize that's your name. Right. I do remember that from being in law school, like with my fingers over the laptop keys, and then you hear your name and you're like, oh, he's calling on someone. Wait, that's me. Oops.
Oopsie. Yeah. So, I think as soon as you recognize that this is your name, you can at least take a deep breath, prepare for the rest of the question. If you're in court or something, you can do this before you stand up to deliver your argument. You might do it with 3 breaths or 5 breaths or the box breathing that we've talked about before. Mm-hmm. But anything you can do to kind of slow down your breathing can really help in a stressful situation. And this is something that ideally you will have practiced beforehand.
Right.
Because it's much easier to go to that. I mean, the Buddhists talk about this, like doing your warrior training. It's much easier when you're in this stressful situation and you're in the middle of the fire. It's much easier to go back to that training if it's sort of habitual. So if this is something that you struggle with, I think having some sort of, we talk about it a lot, mindfulness practice or something like that really can help you in these moments.
Yeah, I was actually just working on some mindfulness curriculum this morning, very timely. And one of the things that was interesting that we were talking about with the mindfulness expert with this curriculum was even just breathing and saying to yourself, I'm inhaling and I'm exhaling like 3 times, which takes very little time, can just calm it down.
Right. You're basically trying to calm the sympathetic nervous system.
Right. You're just saying, like, take a break. There's no lion. I need my brain back.
Yeah.
Please send my brain back.
And you can also, I mean, sometimes professors, if they're super old school, they'll actually make people stand up in class, which is like...
I did not have any of these.
Like, really terrible.
Yeah.
But if that happens, you can actually pay attention to your physical posture. You know, do your Wonder Woman pose. I mean, there's conflicting data now, but there is some data that suggests that like this alone can give you like a confidence boost. But even if you're sitting, you know, you can open your shoulders, you can make eye contact with your professor or the judge, you can sit up straight because you really want to be engaging with the person who's asking these questions, not kind of like hunched away, like looking scared. Like,
Right.
you know, this is definitely, I think, a fake it till you make it sort of confidence thing, that if you look more engaged and more receptive and more confident, you're probably going to feel that way. And certainly your professors are going to respond to you that way,
Right.
which is beneficial.
Yeah. And I think it's also important to somewhat think of this as maybe even a role that you're playing.
Exactly.
Versus making it very personal.
Right.
So for me, that's always, anytime anything is anxiety inducing, if you make it less about you as a person and more about a role, then you don't have as much fear that you're going to mess up.
Yeah, and one thing you can think about in this context, what I was thinking about earlier on this topic, was your role almost is like to help out your classmates. So rather than thinking like, oh, this professor is trying to trick me or whatever, like what can you do, and we can talk about this more later, but what can you kind of do in this context that would be helpful for your classmates, whether that's really engaging with the questions or giving your best shot to like whatever. I think a lot of this comes down to really actually listening, which in a stressful situation can be very difficult.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, I know this from recently living in a Spanish-speaking country. I noticed pretty quickly that if something happened, either I was already stressed out or I was entering a stressful situation and I had to talk in Spanish, my Spanish was terrible.
Yeah.
Or if like thought it was going to go fine and it didn't go fine for some reason, or someone asked me something that I didn't understand or they got annoyed or whatever, like suddenly every word I knew in Spanish went out the window.
Yeah.
And I noticed that people weren't often listening to me either. So, you know, they would kind of make this initial judgment really quickly, like, oh, okay, this is a person who doesn't speak Spanish. And then they wouldn't actually listen to what I was saying, even though I was actually speaking to them in like basically appropriate Spanish with like a reasonable enough accent that they really could have understood it.
Right.
But like their brain had shut down because
Right.
they were stressed out about like, oh my gosh, a gringo walked in. How are we going to communicate? And the answer is like, we can communicate if we actually just listen to each other.
Yeah. And maybe take some deep breaths and calm down.
Exactly. And I mean, sometimes I would literally like take a step back and be like, okay, in my head, this conversation is not going well. Let me like take a deep breath and figure out like how to redirect so that we can start to actually communicate.
And I think as you're learning, especially legal terminology and things like that, when you talk about the law, it can almost feel like you're talking in a foreign language.
Oh, right. Totally.
I was just doing some curriculum on wills and trusts.
Oh.
I know.
That would definitely be a foreign language to me.
But, you know, I'm just like listening to myself talk about things like codicils and, you know, decedents and the testator and this and that. And I'm
You're
just
like,
realizing.
the testicles? No,
I know, exactly. But I'm listening to myself talk saying, wow, this would sound like a foreign language to me in a lot of ways if I didn't know what all these words meant. And I think in the beginning of law school, it can kind of feel that way because you're fumbling through this language that you're not very familiar with. And if you don't kind of pause and take a breath, you won't be able to call on the vocabulary that you're starting to fold into your own.
Yeah, and oftentimes you've got to understand, I mean, some professors are jerks, but a lot of them are actually not trying to be difficult. So oftentimes, you know, they're starting off with a softball question.
What are the facts?
Right, what are the facts of this case?
Right.
I mean, that's something you really ought to be prepared to answer.
Right.
And
if you briefed it, it's like, should be written down.
Yeah,
like
if you briefed it, you book briefed it, you know, you can have your little picture to remind you. These are not intended to be trick questions. But also, I mean, you know, they may ask you something more legal, but if you don't listen, you don't understand that this is like actually pretty basic, or like, what's the procedural posture of this case? How did this case get here?
Right.
They're not trying to trick you. They're just looking for you to give some answer and get a little bit more comfortable.
What was the government's argument?
Right.
What was the...
Yeah,
you know?
what did the prosecutor argue here?
Right.
Like, you know, they're not like tell me your deep theory on like some dissent in this case. It's like, okay, these are the basic things. And I think you can like be prepared for those things.
Mm-hmm. And when you're preparing for class and you're trying to think what should be in my brief, or what should I have taken away from this case, I think if you think through those possible questions, it's a really great way to evaluate whether or not your case brief or your notes are adequate. You should be able to answer those questions for yourself.
Right. I mean, if you've read the case and you're in class, you ought to be able to answer, what are the facts of this case?
Right.
What is the procedural? How did this case get here?
Yeah.
What is what does this side argue? What did that side argue? Like that should be in your.
And what was the outcome? I think that's one that people forget a lot. Like, who won?
Yeah. What happened?
Like, who took the money? Who gets the ducks or the cows or what? In the contracts, it was always about like cows and ducks.
Yeah. Can we split the cow?
Yeah, exactly. So I like that idea of just listening intently. And I think that one of the other things you have to do while you're listening is like take a beat and think before answering.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just like you probably ought not jump into an exam answer without some type of pre-writing outline. You shouldn't immediately jump into a stream of consciousness answer to a question without thinking about it either.
I think some of us who are trained in the law or are drawn to law school, I mean, we're big talkers oftentimes. And, I was listening to myself have an argument with somebody. Fortunately, he doesn't listen to this podcast. But I was even finding myself having to be like, stop, take a breath and think about what you say, because I also just like to talk. And so before I can even evaluate what I was going to say, I just started talking.
Right. And we literally at that point don't know what we're saying.
No, we're just talking.
It's like, what's my opinion on this? Or my opinion on this is, and I'm making it up as I go along, literally.
And I think on my feet pretty well, but that's really not how your most brilliant thoughts are going to escape your mouth. So, if you're going to want to make a thoughtful answer, you have to give yourself time for some thought. And I think that, you might need to take a deep breath. No one's going to notice if you take that breath. You can stall, although sometimes stalling can be a little distracting. I did that in one of my worst call-on experiences in law school. I just started repeating the facts for some reason while I was stalling. And then the professor literally said, thank you for that recitation of the facts. However, that's not at all what I was asking. And I'm like, well, I just bought myself a few minutes.
Yes, I think stalling can be beneficial within reason. If you know that you're someone who gets anxious, you know that you are anxious, you're anticipating that first question, which is indeed, what are the facts of this case? A minor stall of like deep breath, you're thinking, you look at your brief, you look at your outline, your book brief, whatever. And meanwhile, you're saying something along the lines of, okay, well, the facts of the Smith case are.
Right.
That's fine.
Right. But maybe don't recite all those facts if that wasn't the question.
Yeah, but if the question was like, what is the procedural posture? You don't ask about, that's not appropriate.
No.
I think sometimes people, if you realize that you really didn't actually listen to the question or your mind was blank, you can politely ask for it to be repeated. Not again, like repeatedly. But if, you're taken off guard, you don't realize it's your own name, they've asked you something and you finally realize it is you, totally fine to say, oh, professor, I'm sorry, I was getting my thoughts together. Like, could you repeat that? I mean, nobody's going to say no.
Right. Yeah, not even mean professors.
No, because you've already been called on.
Right.
They want you to say something at that point.
They do, because the whole point of the Socratic method is that you can have a dialogue.
Right. I mean, you've got to understand, too, like, they're not necessarily feeling all that confident, although they seem confident.
Yeah.
And, I have friends who are law professors. They admit sometimes they are not totally confident on what they're teaching that day. If it's material that's new or unfamiliar, they're teaching it differently. They might have been up the night before trying to figure out what questions to ask.
Yeah. And if you are teaching in the Socratic method, you need the student to be somewhat successful to make it work.
Right.
A bumbling student who has no answers isn't going to move the class forward.
Yeah, you're not helping anyone at that point.
No. Okay, so along with taking a second to think before answering, you also might need to ask clarifying questions. So if you're not sure what the professor or the judge or your boss is asking, just clarify. So for example, are you asking about the difference between general and specific jurisdiction? With the more information that you get to pull together about what they're asking, you get to give a better answer.
Right. And that also helps your professor. I mean, they are not necessarily, asking exactly the most precise version of the question. And they may also at some point realize they're kind of flailing. And if you ask them, well, it seems to me like what you're asking is the difference between general and specific jurisdiction. Is that right? Because I can help you with that. Right. They're probably going to be like, yes, tell what is general jurisdiction or whatever it is. If they're floundering around in like case world. And even judges. I mean, I worked for a judge. He didn't always know what he was asking half the time. He was on the bench in his judge role, pretending to be very authoritative, and meanwhile is like passing us notes, being like, "What is going on here? Like, what should my next question be?" Or, I mean, I've been in depositions where I was like the second chair, and I'm literally passing questions to the person who's asking the questions, and she doesn't really know what she's asking. It happens.
It happens. And one technique of kind of active listening, if you've ever done kind of an active listening exercise, is repeating back what somebody has just said to you to make sure you understand it before you respond. And so you don't want to like repeat a whole professor's lengthy question.
So are you asking me what the facts are? Yes, I'm asking you the facts.
That's not, but if you were saying, you would like me to clarify that this is, what's the difference between specific and general jurisdiction? Yes. Okay. And then you can kind of go. And so if you can use that technique to make sure that you understand the question, if you don't, you can just, respond back to clarify. And then if you have not been paying attention, it will be very evident. But, but that is just one form of kind of active listening.
Right. I think sometimes too, I mean, you have to understand that like there's a question chain, and at some point in the chain, you're going to probably get to a point where you can't answer the question. And that's just the way the law is. Right. That's when we talk about the difference between like good confusion and bad confusion. Bad confusion is you don't know the procedural posture of the case. You don't know who won. Good confusion is there's some actually very like naughty legal issue, which has a lot of arguments on both sides, and it's sort of unresolved. And your professor is asking you to take a hard stand one way or the other. And you basically get to a point where you're like, I can make both of these arguments, but I can't tell you exactly which one's going to be the winning argument. Right. That's what we do.
That's right. It's the gray area. All lawyers want to live in the gray area. I think one thing that relates to all of this as well is that you also just have to be paying attention. I think in our very distracted world, it is so important to just do one thing at a time. And so if you're finding that you are anxious about being in class and you are anxious about being called on, or you are in a meeting and you're nervous about needing to speak, you need to make sure that you're very present. So maybe, I know this is really hard to do, you might have to turn off your phone. I know. You might have to turn off your phone. You might even have to turn off your Wi-Fi. This is the second. Right now, I have no Wi-Fi on my computer. It's so glorious. I also did something this morning where I turned off my phone and my Wi-Fi.
Wow.
It was amazing. It was like I only did one thing at a time.
Yeah, and I think that's true in class. I mean, I think part of the stress sometimes of being called on is when it's so unexpected and out of the blue, which if you're sitting there reading the New York Times and shopping on Amazon and taking notes and like half listening and suddenly...
And chatting with a friend online.
Yeah, and chatting, and suddenly out of the blue you hear Miss Burgess and you're like, I don't even know what topic we're discussing. I don't know what case we're on.
What class am I in? Am I in criminal procedure? I have no idea.
Yeah, it's Wednesday at 10:30. Okay, it must be Crim Pro. Like, what was the reading? I mean... That's a lot more stressful than if you're kind of playing along with the game and you've been following the class, and then they turn to you and they say, all right, next case.
Right. And, you're paying a lot of money for this class. You might as well just, it's not that long. You don't spend that many hours a day in class. You might as well get the most out of it. But it will lower your anxiety if you are, more engaged in what's happening.
Yeah, and I think this is something, if this is like a huge issue for someone, it might be worth actually talking with your professors about in office hours or something like that. Just saying, hey, I just want you to be aware that like sometimes I freeze if I'm called on, because they might be willing to make some sort of accommodation for you about like, well, they might not, but you may as well at least just discuss it. They might be willing to tell you, okay, I'm going to call on you like this week or whatever. Right. So at least you're more prepared, or I understand that. So I'll give you a couple of seconds if you get called on to put yourself together, that kind of thing.
I mean, I remember I used to do a lot of performing, and when I was a senior in high school, I had performed this one song over and over again. I'd performed it at very, very many different events, and I was very good at it. I had it down. I could do it literally in my sleep, and so I'd been invited to sing at some event, and I was monkeying around with my friends backstage, like not warming up, not paying attention, not doing anything. And then like I walked out on stage, and for the very first time, I literally had no idea what I was supposed to say. I literally mumbled the first line until I could get my head back together. And it was a very telling moment because I just assumed that I had performed the song so many times. I didn't get stage fright anymore. I wasn't nervous, but I had gotten to the point where I just didn't even take it seriously.
Right.
And then I made an ass of myself.
It happens.
It does happen. But it was a good life lesson because I had to remind myself that even if you're good at something, even if you are a little bit confident, you still need to pay attention and be present. So like think about what needs to come out of your mouth before you spit it out.
And I mean, even, you might go into class, and for each class you go into, you might set an intention outside of the class of like, I'm going to be present and focused in this class and do my best. I mean, really that's all anyone can ask of you. If you've done the reading, you're, solid on that. I mean, we often say like, what we're looking for here is a good faith effort. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be like clear that, okay, you've actually like done the reading, you've tried to understand it, you're trying to help the professor out, you're doing what you can, and you're not totally blowing this off.
Right. And some classes are hard and complicated. Like I remember taking federal courts I know, which makes everybody shut up.
I remember that too.
Yeah. But there's stuff in fed courts that's like really complicated and very murky. And I just remember being called on sometimes being like, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times that's actually a fair answer. And the law is just like, I don't actually know the answer. Like, this is how I would think through this problem.
Yeah. Like, these are my thoughts, but I don't know if this is right. This seems totally wackadoodle.
Or they're competing threads, right? Competing narratives.
Same thing. I took a First Amendment class, and I remember at one point going to my professor and being like, I'm trying to outline this material, and it doesn't seem like it is linear and relates to everything in a very like linear, organized way. And he's like, right.
He's like, yes, congratulations.
You now understand the First Amendment.
You've reached step one.
Exactly. You've reached step one in your understanding of the First Amendment.
Yeah, and sometimes I think people, particularly like the first year, think like, oh, there's a correct answer, and they're looking for that answer, and if I get it wrong, it means that I'm stupid or I'm bad at law. Or I mean, part of this too is really just, part of the process. I mean, it's a rite of passage to have your bad on-call experience. We both had it. It's a story you'll tell years later. Yep. Oh, I remember that day in Civ Pro.
My professor does not remember. No one else remembers.
We were both TAs in the classes. We had the worst experience. I mean, I literally don't remember any other time I was on call in law school other than this one Civ Pro. Yeah. And in there, I'd actually raised my hand, which made it doubly humiliating.
Because you volunteered for the experience.
I volunteered for this. And then my professor was one of those moments where he's just looking at me and is literally like, I don't, could somebody else help out with this question?
I mean, it's an ongoing struggle, but this idea of needing to be able to pull your thoughts together when you are under a little bit of stress or when you're called on, I mean, this is what you have to do to practice law. So you want to, think of this as a skill that you're cultivating in the same way that an actor or a singer or a musician practices performing. We're going to talk more about practice in a minute, but to kind of just decide that this is part of your job.
Right. And I think you need strategies too for how do you organize your thoughts. For example, like if you're going to give a detailed response, you probably want to give some structure to that in the beginning. So, being interrupted is annoying and also stress-inducing. And happens a lot more in court probably than in class.
True.
If you're in front of an appellate court, they're going to interrupt you, but lawyers prepare for that.
Right.
They don't prepare to give a linear argument. I mean, I know people who, if they were preparing to argue in front of an appellate court, they would have all of their arguments, say, for example, on flashcards in front of them.
Yeah.
Because they didn't know, of course, they had like 2 minutes prepared that they were happy to give if they could. But generally speaking, they'd get about 10 seconds into it and people would start asking questions. And that's just the way it works. So, they had to be prepared for that. Where they would have the flashcard and they'd be like, okay, you want to talk about that topic? I can talk about it. You want to talk about this? I can talk about it. But also just structuring your thoughts. You know, you can say you want to make several points. Just say that up front. Well, I think there are two different ways to answer this question. Number one, give your answer. Number two, it makes you look thoughtful, it makes you look organized, and kind of tells people where you're going.
Yeah. And it's also a minor stalling technique. Because if you're
exactly,
if you're trying to gather your thoughts and you come up with the fact that you have 3 points,
right?
Just even saying, well, I think there are 3 different ways that we can approach this. Number one, and then that gives you a few more minutes to gather your thoughts.
People use that all the time in court. Your Honor, I think there are 3 critical points we need to consider here. Okay, and they might not let you get through all 3, but at least you've framed it. You've kind of gotten something out. Yeah. And they at least know that there are things that you want to follow up on.
Also, I think another thing you can do is if you have scratch paper on your table, you know, if sometimes jotting down a word or 2 that has come to mind can help you gather your thoughts.
Right, or even just like putting them on your finger and like having your fingers, you know, 1, 2, 3. Like, there are a lot of different things. I mean, you know, I think let's talk about the practice, because I think that is, you know, there are lots of ways that you can kind of practice this skill set, which is a skill set, and you can get better at it.
Yeah.
I mean, one that a lot of people don't want to hear, but is probably actually the most efficient way to get more comfortable with this, is actually to start volunteering to participate in class, even if you're not 100% sure of the answer. Because the more you do it, you're desensitized.
Yeah.
And hopefully by your 3rd year, you're like, oh, I can't believe how upset I used to get about this.
Right. No, that's true. And you got to get used to hearing your own voice and not getting weirded out by it.
Which no one likes.
No one likes.
Most people.
Yeah. Well, there are plenty of people who like their own voice, but but many people are self-conscious about it. I think using study groups or safe places where there maybe isn't a professor or the stakes aren't as high to start practicing talking about this stuff is also a really great place to do these exercises, because if you can discuss the law in a thoughtful way with your peer group, you can probably pull it together in class as well.
Right. And you can even practice putting each other on the spot. You know, one person is a professor and they turn to someone in the group and say, you know, Bob, tell us the facts of this case. And then Bob does it and you all kind of critique like, well, you know, this was good. This wasn't so good. You could have done this. You could have done that. But the more you do it, obviously, the easier it's going to get.
I think there still is this idea amongst a lot of folks that it's just easy for some people to do this stuff. And I guess there are some people who can just talk off the cuff and there's no problem.
Well, I mean, there are people who really just talk a lot.
Right. But
those people don't necessarily always have the best stuff to say.
That's true.
I mean, quickly in a law school classroom, it's like, wow, that person talks a lot and says very little.
Very little, yeah. But this is a learned skill. And if you, depending on what type of law you want to practice or what type of role you want to have, you do need to get comfortable gathering your thoughts and presenting them in a way. Even let's say you decide not to practice law at all, but you're going to be the executive director of a nonprofit. Where you still have to.
Are you going to be in a meeting ever in your life?
Are you going to stand in front of a benefit and give a talk and talk about your accomplishments or what the organization has been doing? I mean, there are going to be lots of different ways that you have to be in this role, and you have to practice and evaluate it. I mean, let's use us as an example. How long have we been? The Law School Toolbox is like 7 years old? Something like that. Anyway, we're well into our elementary school years at this point.
True.
But if you go back to our earliest content, much of which is thankfully not discoverable on the internet, it was a little rough.
Well, even the early podcasts, I feel, we've improved.
We have improved, because I listened to myself and critiqued myself a little bit.
No, I used to listen to them back in the day and was like, wow, this is really painful.
I noticed things that I did that I didn't notice, that I didn't know I did.
Yeah, of course. And that's why I always say if you want to do better interviews, have somebody videotape yourself because it's painful to watch.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there's this idea that you should just automatically be good at it, but like any type of skill, you've got to practice it and evaluate it. And so another way to think about this, I think, if you're really struggling with thinking on your feet, is to get out of the law school arena and start practicing in other ways. So some people like Toastmasters. I have a lot of friends who do improv comedy. I know, which makes you shudder. I know. I know. You should not go to improv comedy. But
I used to date someone who was really into that. So, yeah.
Well,
it's very good for thinking on your feet.
It is. But if you are really struggling with just being comfortable thinking on your feet, I think doing a class like that over the summer or whatever. You don't have to do any of the performances. And like, who cares if these random people think that you're goofy? It's a safe place.
It's pretty goofy overall.
I mean, it's kind of goofy.
I mean, you can also use humor, and
That's
if
true.
you're really flailing in these situations,
That's
like,
true.
say that you just absolutely bombed something with your professor asked you. I mean, you could burst into tears, which is probably not effective.
I would say that tears are typically not effective.
Generally not effective. Or you could say, basically shrug your shoulders and kind of smile and be like, well, I guess I got that totally wrong.
Yeah.
And then they'll probably give you the right answer and you'll move on, you know. So, I mean, it's hard to do when you're stressed out, but humor is always helpful in these situations.
I also think that, okay, so if improv comedy is like not your jam, I think that any sort of type of performing or practicing or skill where you are putting yourself in a role and putting yourself in front of people is helpful. So I used to do a lot of theater and a lot of singing and performing, and I think that just doing more of that, even if you're not really great. I mean, there are groups that you don't have to be very good at that. It can be very helpful, and that can teach you that idea of, it being less personal to you.
Right.
And that is a great skill. I think one of the things that lawyers do when they go out into the real world is we do dress up for these roles. That's why you put on the suit,
have your lawyer shoes,
and you do your hair, and you've got your briefcase or whatever. And when you go to court, and it's all very formal. I mean, even the judge is dressed up. Everybody's dressed up.
Yeah, they're literally wearing a robe.
They're wearing a robe.
In England, they're wearing like white hair.
Right, exactly. And so, because the deal is this is about a persona and a role. And so you want to start practicing what it feels like to be in that role. And law school is a great place to do that. When you do your first moot court argument, I think that's your first experience typically of, putting on the suit, like getting into that role and finding that confidence. And I think if you can start to separate those two things, your own personal feelings of insecurity and then who you are in this role, I think that's going to really pay off for you in the long run. Also, then if you screw up, it's just not as personal. It's like the lawyer in me screwed up, not the person.
Exactly. I mean, law school is basically a lot about faking confidence.
Yeah.
And lawyers fake it all the time.
The time.
Once you get to know some acting, once you start working and you get to know, before you think, the managing partner of this firm, and professors too. I remember a professor who was very well known, made tons of money as a consultant, whatever, top of his field, sent me his draft for comments because I was his RA, and he's basically sent this cover email being like, I know this is probably terrible, but please be gentle, with my feelings, and I know it's awful, and I've read it, and of course I'm it's brilliant. So we all think that this is all about us, and it's really actually just sort of about the work and about faking this confidence.
Yeah. I remember going to meet with a professor once, and she was like, do you know why no one wants to come to my office hours? And I was like, I don't.
You're like, and I'm here at your office hours.
I don't know. I think I was her TA. Okay. But I was like, I'm not sure. And she was like, I think she was really concerned that it was something about her that nobody wanted to come hang out with her.
No, I mean, professors are totally neurotic. So they're probably feeling bad about themselves for asking bad questions if you're not able to follow them in class.
Or that they're not liked, or that nobody wants to come.
And I mean, I think too, you can also consider sort of broader approaches to anxiety if this is really a debilitating issue for you. I mean, typically, I'm guessing there's probably some test anxiety going on if that's the case.
Right.
So, as with someone who we talked about pressure said to me once, he's like, well, test anxiety is basically just anxiety. You've got to treat the anxiety, and then the test anxiety will probably pretty much take care of itself. Yeah. So, things like therapy, medication, yoga, meditation, all these things, you want to at least look into some resources just about anxiety.
Yeah. I think practicing and getting more comfortable in these roles, and then thinking down the road, what sort of legal job do you want? What sort of roles are you going to need to play? And then look for those opportunities in law school to better those skills, because you'd much rather feel like a joke in law school.
Yeah, I mean,
I
always say it's far better to make the mistake in class than on the exam.
Oh, yeah.
Because once you've screwed something up once, you're probably not going to screw it up again.
Yeah.
So may as well make those mistakes beforehand.
Yeah.
All right, well, with that, unfortunately, we are out of time. If you enjoyed this episode of the Law School Toolbox podcast, please take a second to leave a review and rating on your favorite listening app. We would really appreciate it. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss anything. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to reach out to Lee or Alison at lee@lawschooltoolbox.com or Alison at lawschooltoolbox.com. Or you can always contact us via our website contact form at, wait for it, lawschooltoolbox.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk soon.